morning. My name's Josh and I work for Forecast at the Intensive Case Manager in the housing team in Lindsay. So I'm here today to talk about the individual service plan, which is going to be the SPDAT care plan. So this is derived from the SPDAT assessment that we do with clients, particularly the full SPDAT assessment. So this would be where each client scores from 0 to 4 in acuity on each of the 15 sections. So once we've taken the time to go through the SPDAT with the client, then what we're going to do is we're going to take our notes that we wrote down when we did the SPDAT assessment and the score from each section and come up with a care plan for each of those sections. So the care plan is intended to give us some next steps and direct the service that we provide based on the information and scores that we got from their SPDAT. So the idea is that we're looking to be preventative and trying to understand what might be some of the risks of tenancy and losing their tenancy that we need to be aware of, and what are some of the areas that are of high concern and some of the areas that are of low concern, which we would then reframe and consider as strengths for folks. So through the SPDAT, we're able to help identify some of these things, and then we can discuss what we believe would be the best course of action for each one of these sections. And then we'll talk about it after, but then we can mutually decide on what some goals might be with clients. So each section, like I said, has a score. So based on the score, we're going to decide what kind of an action that section requires. So the first section, for example, is mental health and cognitive functioning. So depending on the score that they got, it will depend on what kind of supports or what kind of action we might take on that. So if they scored a 0 or a 1 or even a 2, then likely there's not a lot of supports required. If they're identified as managing everything on their own without intensive supports, then really there's no need for any sort of referral unless that's something that they expressed interest in, and their housing shouldn't really be affected by their mental health unless there's specific concerns that we've noted otherwise. If it's a 3 or a 4, then this means that it's an area of concern that their mental health could impact their housing, and that's really the focus that we want to take, is how could the concerns that they've identified or we've discussed with them about their mental health or received information from other service providers or hospital records, how could that directly impact their housing, and what course of action would be appropriate to take to help mitigate those concerns. So that could be something as simple as connecting them to CMHA to discuss some of those concerns. It could be that they're struggling to maintain their medication and they're interested in some support, whether that be a blister pack or dispensed through pharmacy daily or dispensed through something like an ACT team if they would qualify for that. And similarly, if they score a 4 and there's multiple hospitalizations, then we're looking at how is that going to impact their housing, and what would be the appropriate actions to take to help mitigate any concerns that might have. Now, the fact that they have heightened mental health concerns doesn't necessarily mean that their mental health will impact their housing. It just means that there's a higher chance that it could. So it's possible that while they have mental health concerns, that when discussing the impact it might have on their housing and spending some time with them, and after they've lived in their unit, you may come to realize that this is just them and that's their baseline, and that those concerns are not going to impact their housing. In which case, then you would just kind of leave things as are and just continue to monitor and make sure that their mental health isn't impacting. The big one that you're looking for in terms of mental health would be hoarding, because that will lead to specific tenancy issues in terms of smell, in terms of fire access, cleanliness of unit. So that'll start to lead to things that could cause concerns with the landlord and directly relate to tenancy impact. So that's the mental health section. The next section is physical health. Going to take a similar approach. If their physical health is identified as a lot of folks we find have 4s because they have co-occurring chronic health issues, and so oftentimes they will end up scoring a 4. And again, this doesn't necessarily mean that will impact their housing directly, but it could mean that they're going to struggle to be able to maintain their unit in terms of chores and in terms of housekeeping, or maybe they're limited in their ability to get to the bank or to pay rent or some of these things. So we want to flush out what those concerns could be. And it's possible that if they have co-occurring chronic conditions, that they'll always have those. Things like chronic pain or diabetes or heart problems or respiratory issues. Some of those things may never go away, and so they may always have those things. And so again, initially when you're doing this, you're wanting to learn about what's the potential impact on their housing, and then taking your care plan in a direction that's related to that impact. In terms of medication, you're going to be looking again at that score and how it might relate. So depending on if they're taking their medications or if they're selling their medications or giving away their medication, those could lead to tenancy issues in terms of traffic if they're selling their medication, or if people are coming by to get their medication and it's affecting them. Likely that's going to lead to affecting them in other areas such as physical health or mental health, and then we can figure out what that impact might look like. Substance use, so again, discussing whether it's life-threatening, whether it's above the healthy drinking guidelines, and this will provide us some information around their level of substance use. And always we're bearing in mind that these concerns are concerns in that specific domain, and if they're interested in exploring additional resources or referrals to other supports, then certainly we will help with that. But if they're not wanting to make any changes in those areas, then we're not out to persuade them or convince them to make changes. We're only out to discuss any impact that it might have on their tenancy and figure out how we can mitigate those concerns. So substance use typically associates with noise concerns, traffic, damage, affect the cleanliness and maintenance of the unit. So those are kind of the concerns that you're looking for in that section specifically. Experience of abuse and trauma. So again, it very clearly states in the SPDAT if trauma is the cause of homelessness, or if it's led them to homelessness, or if it has any impact on their daily functioning. So based on that response in that section, based on their response of being a 4, a 3, or a 2, or a 1, or a 0, it'll kind of lead you to what direction you take. So if it's impacting their daily functioning, then you want to learn about how and what you can do to help support them with that. If it's been the cause of their homelessness, then it's important to understand why. And if it's currently the cause of their homelessness, then you definitely need to understand that. In both of those scenarios, you want to look for, when making future plans and supporting them to find housing, how did the trauma lead to you losing their housing in the first place, so that you can understand what might be the risks in the future and take some prevention. Risk of harm to self or others. So this would fall into some of the safety concerns, and this might be something that leads you into your crisis plan and to discuss what can you do to help them feel safe there, and what kind of plan can you put together. Depending on the amount of concerns that they identify and the level of concern will depend on what kind of a plan you want to put together with them. If they're not feeling safe, then that's going to be problematic most times, because they're going to want to either not spend time at their unit or invite other people to their unit to feel more comfortable, or maybe use substances to cope with that, or other coping mechanisms such as self-harm or substances or what else they might kind of reach out to, and those might impact their tenancy. So exploring some of the possible safety concerns and trying to make a crisis plan or a safety plan with them will be beneficial for this section. Involvement in high risk or exploitative situations. Many of the situations that they'll be involved in or the ways in which they're exploited are going to directly impact their tenancy. So if people are taking advantage of them financially, it could affect their ability to pay rent. If they're taking advantage of them by letting themselves into their unit or stealing food or items from their unit, then it could affect their tenancy at their unit and their ability to be there, and lead to noise complaints or traffic concerns. And so you're wanting to flush out what some of those things might be, and then help to find ways that they can feel safe and comfortable again. A lot of the actions you take are going to be similar to the previous section, because you're looking to find ways that they don't end up being exploited and that they aren't in high-risk situations. Certain things that are going to be considered high risk, like having unprotected sex or IV substance use, those might be things that are more harmful or risk towards their own individual life and affect them more on a personal level, and may not have as much of an impact on their tenancy directly. It might be more of an indirect impact. So exploring some of those things in relation to what that indirect impact might be is important. But if IV substance use or unprotected sex or sex work is something that they plan to continue, then they're just always going to score high in that section, and that's always going to be something to just monitor. They may not ever really want to make changes in that area, and it may not directly ever impact their housing or tenancy. Okay, so the next section is interaction with emergency services. Mostly this is going to be around understanding how often police or EMS is called or they're using crisis services. In terms of the impact on their tenancy, if police are often coming to the unit or they're often being taken out in an ambulance, these could lead to concerns from the landlord, and it could be because some of their actions or behaviors are things that might affect the other tenants there. Good information to have. Oftentimes this is where you want to check hospital records and see if you can get consent with police or EMS to discuss things with them. Clients are often going to forget because you're asking them in the last 6 months, so it's pretty common for them to either forget how many times they've been or when they've gone and what the specifics were, or maybe just underreport or overreport depending on what they recall. So good information to have. You want to minimize the interactions as much as you can. So that might be looking at things like, do they have a family physician? Are they using the EMS services instead of times when they could be using a walk-in service, or making crisis calls to a crisis line instead of going to the hospital? So we want to look at minimizing those things, but again, it may not be something that we can prevent entirely. Many folks wind up getting fairly serious infections from substance use, or have a history of severe mental health, and so these things may still lead to EMS or hospitalization, and that's just going to be part of their lifestyle, and that'll just continue to be something that we monitor and see if it has impact on their tenancy. Legal, so we want to know about conditions like probation, parole, where they can be, who they can interact with. The basic premise here is that if they violate some of the legal requirements that they have, then they could be incarcerated, and if they're incarcerated, they could lose their income, and if they lose their income, then they may no longer be able to pay rent and maintain their unit. So we're wanting to look at helping them avoid incarceration and helping them follow the conditions or restrictions that they have, so that they can continue to live in their unit and have the financial capacity to maintain their unit. And so the more outstanding legal issues that they have, the more likely that they could be incarcerated, and that's why the risk is higher in this section. Managing tenancy, so we're looking at things like how often do they need support from us or other housing support workers, how many times have they been rehoused in the past year, are they able to live in one spot consistently, are they fleeing for safety reasons. So we're starting to get an idea of what has their tenancy looked like over the past year, and trying to understand what has worked in the past, what hasn't worked in the past, and reflecting on that with them to see how we can make a plan for the future so that the tenancy that they're currently in is successful. If they've been a lot of places in the past year, and this is like the first time they've had a stable housing for maybe 6 months, then there's going to be a lot of discomfort and a lot of unknown in the fact that they're being housed somewhere permanently, and this is going to be a new experience for them, so it's going to be challenging. So having information around past tenancy is important, and it's an opportunity to learn about them and to help prepare for what some of the future concerns could be. Personal administration, money management. So the main takeaway here is that we want to encourage folks to set up pay direct if possible. Oftentimes, non-payment of rent is a concern for a lot of people, not everybody. So we want to eliminate the risk of whether it's a banking error or whether it's something not coming out at the right time or them forgetting to leave a certain amount of money in there or taking money out too early. So we want to minimize the risk of their rent not being paid by setting up pay direct if we can. We might look at doing the honest monthly budget with them would be part of this section and something that we could include in our plan. And then maybe a referral to trustee if that's something they were agreeable to or interested in and felt was helpful. Mainly we want to see, is their rent getting paid? And then beyond that, where does their money go after that? So if their rent's being paid, that's the first priority. And then if they're paying things like tenant insurance or cell phone or any other hydro or bills that are required after that, then that's the second important part. And then beyond that, ideally they're still putting money towards things like groceries or supplies, but they might at that point be finding it difficult to manage and spending money on either substance use or just not have a lot of money coming in and having an income that's not sufficient to get them through the month. And so this would be where we would look at things like food banks or other food programs that could be helpful, as well as seeing if there's any opportunity from ODSP or OW or their formal source to increase their income through things like transportation or special diet or any special allowances that they might have access to. Social relationships and network. So this would lead us to do a guest policy with somebody, and this form would help to flush out some of the folks that are positive, some of them that could be negative or have an impact on their tenancy, and start to talk to people about who do they tend to interact with, what are their relationships like, what's their support system like, and starting to see how they're going to manage these things. And having a good support system will be helpful in terms of managing some of the stress that pops up of owning your own apartment or living in your own space. And so we want to also find out, are the guests and people that they're having come around, are they having an impact on them in a negative way? So are they leading to noise complaints or traffic concerns, or are they stealing from the client, or are they staying and refusing to leave? And so getting an understanding of what that situation looks like, and then doing a guest policy and taking an action from there around what might be the next steps that would be helpful for that person. Self-care and daily living, so we're wanting to see what is their ability to maintain their unit and maintain themselves, and what kind of strategies might be helpful. A lot of times, if folks haven't lived on their own often, or maybe at all, or for a long time, there might be some life skills that they're struggling with. So we want to support them to enhance those skills so that they can start to become more independent. So things like cooking, cleaning, doing laundry, doing dishes, making sure their unit's locked, understanding what it means to be a respectable tenant. So there can be a lot of information and education provided during this part, and a lot of skills training to provide folks with the ability to be more independent and manage their unit more effectively and more successfully. Then we move on to meaningful daily activities. A lot of times, if folks have something meaningful going on in their day and in their week, then they're more likely to be content and more likely to keep busy and feel engaged with their community. So we want them to be out and about in the community a reasonable amount so that they can engage with their community and start to feel comfortable and not feel isolated to their apartment. And we want to see that they have activities that will help them to relieve stress and to provide them with some fulfillment, so that it'll help them manage some of the stresses and struggles that they'll have living in their unit. This is a very subjective section, so if somebody identifies something like playing cards as a meaningful activity, or going for a walk, or going for a hike, or collecting marbles, or whatever is specific to them that they decide is helpful, then that's fine. We just go with whatever they feel is something that's meaningful to them. There's no right or wrong answer. And the last one is history of housing and homelessness. So knowing the history of their tenancy and when they've been homeless and for how long and what that's looked like is going to help to paint a picture of what their current tenancy might look like and provide us with some information that we can use to make a plan with them. So depending on the amount of times that they've been homeless, and if it's been chronic homelessness, so 6 months or longer, then we'll get some information around what their norm has been. And if their norm has been, shelters and outside and couch surfing, then being in an apartment or a room on their own could be something that's very foreign to them. And again, that's going to give us some information around how challenging it's going to be for them to adapt to that new situation, and help provide us with some information as to what the struggles are going to be for them. So at the end, you're going to get a total score from the SPDAT, and that will help kind of direct where their acuity's at. Ideally, when you put these plans together, their score continues to go down over time, and that will indicate that they're getting more stable and more independent. From this plan and the SPDAT, you can create a summary for all of the sections around their score and kind of the key takeaways from each section, and then sit down with them and meet and discuss kind of each section and go through and see if there's 2 or 3 sections that they scored high in that they feel like could be a risk to their housing and that they could identify as a goal that they'd like to work on. So for example, if something like money was a risk, was a high number, and that was because they feel like they don't have the ability to budget and they're just not very savvy at budgeting, then maybe their goal might be to do the honest monthly budget with you and put together a plan, or maybe a referral to a trustee. So you want to work with them, and you're doing the assessments every 3 months once you get going, after they've settled in and been there for 3 months or longer. So each time you revisit them in 3 months, then you're getting an opportunity to see what sections are staying the same, what sections are fluctuating, and what goals have they set each time, and how did those goals go? Were they able to make progress towards those? Were they realistic goals? How did they feel that worked? And are there goals that they'd like to continue to work on, or maybe change, or maybe they want to set new goals for next time. And so every 3 months you have a chance to kind of revisit that and create a plan with them. So this is the main tool that helps drive the support that we provide to people. And from this plan, we meet with them and try to set some goals, and then we gear our housing support with each individual based on what the goals and the plan that is mutually put together, to try to do everything that we can to prevent them from having any tenancy issues and be more independent and stable in their housing. So that is the purpose of the individual service plan from the SPDAT care plan. And it's a very important tool as it drives the program.